And we just keep going, adding more systems.
Yield, classroom design.
Well, no, we're trying to keep the same formula, right? So when they build the third one, the second one becomes the old new classroom building.
There's also
The new classroom.
There's also, I can't believe this is a classroom building. It can't be a classroom building.
I mean, that's just, that's an approach.
Yeah.
You call this a classroom building?
Yeah.
Now that's what I call a classroom
Yeah,
building.
sure.
All right, let's go ahead and get started for today. Today we have Chelsea Thompto. Okay, sorry. Okay. So I have the pleasure of introducing Chelsea today. She is a transdisciplinary artist and assistant professor here at Virginia Tech, whose research engages with art, trans studies, and technology. Chelsea utilizes code, video, sound, writing, books, and sculpture in a research-based studio practice to challenge political, bureaucratic, and technological systems that attempt to categorize trans bodies and the subsequent violence those systems produce. Chelsea is quite prolific in both her inventiveness as well as quantity, quality, and breadth of projects. Chelsea's written work has appeared in Trans Studies Quarterly and Inside Higher Ed, among other publications. Her artwork has appeared in exhibits across the United States, Canada, and Berlin. Her work includes a speculative technology, the fog pill, which upon implantation in the dermis layer of the skin would produce a fog as a means of resisting visibility and surveillance of trans bodies, or her trans code, which reproduces English through a binary system that, when used, becomes less binaristic. In addition to Chelsea's work, she is a dedicated mentor and instructor, teaching dozens of courses over the past decade, serving as a queer mentor, and receiving an Excellence in Teaching award this past year, among her other awards, fellowships, commissions, speaking engagements, and recognitions that she has received over the years. It is a pleasure to host Chelsea today, and hear more about her innovative and constructive work. So please help me in welcoming her today.
And then
There you go.
because you mentioned it in the introduction, but it's not in my slides, the trans code that kind of translates English into a coded language is also a tattoo on my arm. So I'm like, I don't have a slide, but I can just hold my arm up so you can see that piece. Which is to say, I'm really interested in
Yeah.
kind of like pushing boundaries of where art happens and still not working. How about now?
That sounds good.
Sounds good? And I'll stand perfectly still so that it doesn't. All right, so a couple programming notes. One, you're going to see links on the slides in blue, and you might wonder why. And that's because at the end, there'll be a QR code in case you're interested in following up on any of the things. The other thing to note is that there is a lot of video throughout all the slides. None of them have sound except for the very last one. So especially for folks on Zoom, as long as you're seeing moving images and hearing my voice, you're not missing any sound, except again for that very last video. So yeah, before I get started, I do want to talk just a little bit about what it means to be an artist in an academic setting. I'm going to go ahead and set my timer. And so I wanted to start here with a piece I actually did in my undergraduate. So when we're thinking about an artist working in an academic space, sometimes there's the propensity to think of like the artwork as something over here and then the academic scholarship as like a way to legitimize the artwork. But instead, I really like to insist on an art practice itself as being scholarly labor. And so since the mid-2000s, I've been making work around ideas of systems. In the late aughts, I guess you would call it, when I came out as trans, I started to also make work about being trans, because one thing about being trans is that the second you come out as trans, you are then perceived as trans, and that poses all sorts of problems and opportunities. So this work is from my undergraduate BFA thesis show, and I think it does a good job of kind of explaining this idea of both systems thinking and also kind of shows an investment in a material process. So this is made using CNC laser cut steel and welding. You can see the individual pieces here. So all of these are actually identical sculptures with hinges, and they are just sort of formulated in these different iterations on this 8-foot by 8-foot board. So I'm a transdisciplinary artist working across digital and traditional media, focused on the politics of visibility and on the trans body as a site of political violence and potential. And while I don't normally bring this kind of thing into my talks, I think it is a particularly toxic moment right now. So I did want to kind of explain what I mean by political violence. So trans bills in the United States over the past 5 years have seen really a skyrocketing number of bills meant to curtail trans rights and trans life in the world. I find myself uniquely positioned to think about these things because I've been out as a trans person for over 15 years. So I was out and talking about trans thing before Laverne Cox was on the cover of Time magazine in the transgender tipping point in 2015, and I've been living in the world since then as well. And I think there are a lot of ways to think about the political movements between 2009, 2010, and now. But I think one key way to think about these things is through the vector of visibility, which is what my work does. So when we're thinking about trans people being visible, I'm also thinking about like where we can actually be, right? So this is a map that was just updated this week from someone called Aaron in the Morning, who does a lot of reporting on trans issues. You'll see 3 states marked with black and red dashes, and those are states that are considered legally inadvisable for trans people to go to at all. And I think it's important when we talk about political violence to talk about like what that means and how that actually curtails like material opportunities in the world, right? I'm not going to apply for an art opportunity in Florida or Texas or Kansas. And while you might not think that there are many art opportunities in Kansas, they do exist. And so I really like to kind of, put a really fine point on this idea of when I say political violence, I mean like actual material violence that is happening right now in our world. In my practice, I examine and create systems as a mode of creative production and exploration. I'm interested in both material specificity and in using materials that help me touch an idea. So I am trained first and foremost as a sculptor. I started using power tools before the age of 10. My dad had me and my sister using scroll saws and drills and all sorts of things at a very young age. And my bachelor's degree and first master's degree were in sculpture. So that's building objects with my hands, mostly wood, metal, some digital fabrication. And it wasn't until later in graduate school that I picked up the more technologically focused portion of the work. Technology here in big scare quotes, because as you all know, technology is not just the super complicated stuff in our world. But I'm really, really engaged with code, not only because of its social problematics, but also because I have found that it is a way for me to actually articulate my thinking in a really exciting way. So one example is this piece here. This man doesn't exist. He was created using a generative adversarial neural network, which is the boring term that was used like 1.5 years before people just started calling it Gen AI. This is an image generation software that created new quote-unquote human faces from 70,000 Flickr images, right? So this is an image from a project called This Person Does Not Exist. I took that image and then I went to a place called Ancestry.com that has a program called Deep Nostalgia that allows you to, in one of the most creepy and horrifying uses of AI that I know of, animate photos of your dead relatives so that you can see what they might have actually been like if they were alive. I think, as you can see, it doesn't do a very good job. I then took the fake person with the fake movement and I applied facial recognition back on top of that image. And I think that this does a really good job of what I mean by thinking about systems, and also what I mean when I say that I'm interested in like specific materials, right? It means something that it is a fake face. It means something that it's fake motion, and it means something. Some notable questions that have driven my studio practice include: who made the river a cyborg? Which was a question that I had while driving over the Mississippi River to visit my parents. Started to think about the lock and dam and channel system on the Mississippi and the ways in which colonial logic was used to sort of extract value from the river and turn it into a highway. And I started to think about the ways that trans and queer people's bodies are also subjected to similar logics in terms of making them useful, usable research subjects, even when we have to engage with a lot of those systems in order to access care. What would happen if the spine of a book was a point rather than a line? So this question asks, if we think about a book, when you open it, there's a line right here. And I thought, well, what would it be like if pages orbited around a central point? So in order to get to that idea, I 3D modeled a nodal book structure that allowed me to attach pages to an orbiting node and then attach those nodes together so you get this sort of like atomic nonlinear artist book form. That was then 3D printed and takes the form of an artist book today. So you can take this book, set it up with a number of nodes and sort of move through the pages, but the pages are not in a sequential order, right? So suddenly something that would have been on page 14 and then on page 37, well, now I can take those two pages and I can put them right next to one another. So like, how does that maybe problematize legibility, but then how does it maybe also horizontalize a narrative? So I'm not having to do a linear A to B narrative, but I can do something a little bit different. As a trans person, is it better to be seen accurately or not seen at all? So this led to my work, Landmarks, which I will be talking about a little bit later. And it's really to think here about when we're thinking about systems of machine learning, especially things like facial recognition, it's not enough to say trans people are misrecognized and that's a bad thing. We might instead need to say we should stop trying to recognize people's faces with this technology. And the violence that it does as a whole is maybe something we need to oppose, and that we really need to be thinking about the trans case study in this not as a way to improve the technology, but as a kind of cornerstone for abolishing the technology and its violent outputs in our world. Can fog be an aspirational figure for trans embodiment and resistance? This was the cornerstone question of a commission I did for the San Jose Museum of Art that also spilled out into a variety of other projects, including the speculative technology mentioned in the introduction, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And what do we lose when we look to algorithms, AI in quotes, to make our world? And this led to a piece called Consensus Sensing, where I, in a very limited capacity, asked popular image generation models to make trans women to try interpretation, right? I'm not like, anyone can come away with any ideas that they want from my work at all. Like, I have political investments, and I really care deeply about this subject matter, but I don't necessarily need everyone to come through with one linear understanding of how this thing should or should not be understood. So I'm invested in criticism, speculation, and experimentation. I use technology, or what we understand to be technology, which is often computer-related, but I'm also very dubious of it. There's a wonderful piece I know that says, it's like a website that says, how will technology solve this problem? And when you click the button, it says, technology doesn't solve problems. And that's all it says over and over again. Technology does not solve your problems. It produces problems that then humans have to solve, which I find really useful and interesting. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea of research-based transdisciplinary artists, right? So I've talked a bit about the artist part. I've talked a little bit about the research part. But I want to talk a little bit about why I use the term transdisciplinary as opposed to maybe multi or interdisciplinary or non-disciplinary. So trans as a prefix means across, beyond, and through. And for me, in my studio, in my creative process, I think about trans as a gesture, as a form, as an identity, and as a method, right? And so trans operates across all of these registers in the work that I'm making. So when I'm thinking about one of these questions that I was proposing, I'm not thinking about, okay, it's going to be in code, and then it's separately going to be over here in this other thing. It's like, how can I take this question? How is its articulations through this material change when I start pushing it into this other material? And it's actually that movement between one material and another, whether that material is writing, academic writing, and coding, or sculpture, or any of these things. But it is that movement across medium and across disciplines that allows for like new understandings of the questions that I'm asking. So I want to talk a little bit about the title of this talk, which was Technologies of Seeing and Fantasies of Knowing. So I really like to bring this up to my students. I'm teaching a new media art theory class this semester. We often use technology as a shorthand to mean certain things, but I really love this quote by Ursula K. Le Guin, which is, "Technology is the active human interface with the material world. But the word is consistently misused to mean only the enormously complex and specialized technologies of the past few decades, supported by massive exploitation of both natural and human resources." So I bring this up here because as much as I am talking about things like machine learning and facial recognition, I also am talking about things like maps, which are technologies that have been around a long time. And in fact, some of the inherent violences that come with mapping an area are reproduced in things like facial recognition, right? So while a lot of the technology here can be seen as cutting edge, quote unquote, or innovative, a word that I hate, I really do mean to think about technology as spanning backwards as well as forwards in our understanding. So some technologies of seeing that I have engaged with and am interested in that don't show up specifically in the work but are related to the work. I'm sure most people are familiar with this machine or a machine similar. This is the body scanning machine at airports. There is a really lovely piece called Design Justice, linked in the next slide, that goes through and talks about this more. But one thing that I realized when I first came out as trans was that when you walk through one of these detectors, there's nothing automatically selecting your gender. The TSA agent on the other side looks through the machine, they look at you, and they pick male or female. And that calibrates the machine for how your body is going to be read, right? So it is a technology, right, in that it calibrates the machine to do a certain thing. But there's also this incredibly human element where it's like, do I pass to my mom? Do I pass to the TSA agent? Do I pass to the barista? Right? There are these different registers of gender passing. And that becomes like a really complex system to navigate. So if you've never actually looked, right, if you get to the other side and there's a quote unquote problem with your body, you will end up with these little red and yellow zones that tell the TSA agent where they need to investigate, right? But you can see here that there is a pink and blue button for which way the scan is going to go. And it really, again, it comes down to this idea that like we think of this as a super high-tech thing, but what it comes down to a person's social understanding of your gender while you stand inside of this machine with your shoes off, right? When you start to think about it, it's extremely contrived. Next, I don't know if anyone saw this ad. I didn't actually see the ad because I don't watch the Super Bowl, but this is the horrible Ring ad that talked about like saving and finding your dog by massive surveillance of every community all at once, and that means your golden retriever will be safe, which is all that really matters, right? We can give up all of our autonomy and all of our safety to this corporation because Milo's back, thank goodness, right? And so part of this for me, this technologies of seeing, is that there is a real push right now to take this quote unquote AI-powered technology and really use it as a moment to massively expand our already very robust surveillance state in the United States. And trans people find themselves in the sort of crush between these systems very often, right? Because if you are misidentified, that becomes a problem. And being a problem to an automated system is dangerous in so many ways. Which leads me to fantasies of knowing, right? So with a lot of these companies, the idea is if I can see it, I can know it, and I can understand it, and then I can do something with it. In this, I'm really interested in Jorge Luis Borges as a writer. You'll notice that both of my quotes today are from fiction authors and science fiction authors in particular, because I find a lot of inspiration. This is a quote from not much longer than this piece called On Exactitude in Science. In that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city, and the map of the empire the entirety of a province. In time, those unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and the Cartographers Guild struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire, which coincided with it point to point. Right? So this idea of this sort of like ridiculous exercise of mapping to the point where the map becomes a one-to-one model of the thing. And I think that we are seeing in our society this kind of unconscionable map of data, really, right? Where we are gathering and analyzing and generating so much data in order for people to like understand and have this fantasy that they can know all and see all. The other piece I want to talk about here, this is from a 1970s advertisement for the Army Corps of Engineers work on the Mississippi River Channel project, right? So this is them basically giving you a brochure of like why you should drive the scenic Iowa and Wisconsin countryside along the Mississippi River. And up in the corner here is there's something called a river chronology. And that river chronology starts in 1670 when French explorers open the Mississippi River to the white man, capital W, capital M, from 1670 to 1730, right? So in their understanding, the river doesn't exist until a white man sees it, right? So the river chronology exists once it has become the subject of colonization and not before, right? This is obviously a fantasy. The river has existed before this. It will exist beyond whatever comes after. So the other thing, the way that I think about this in a more contemporary context is through the ways in which facial recognition technology claims to be able to predict your emotions. So it uses something called facial landmarks to see like where your eyebrows are, where your nose is, where your eyes are, your mouth, your jawline. And from there, it can say, are you fearful, disgusted, happy, surprised, sad, angry, or neutral? We all know that is the full spectrum of human emotion, all of which can be seen on your face at any given moment, right? When you're laughing, it's always because you're happy and not because you're enraged, right? That is, of course, a farce. And yet, this is encoded into a system. So this, just for like a little bit of a technical aside, this is me pulling out the sort of like raw data analytics from a JavaScript library that's used to analyze live webcam video. So how am I doing time-wise? Perfect. I'm going to talk now about 3 projects that sort of go into this idea of technologies of seeing and fantasies of knowing. The first, Landmarks, is from around 2020 to 2022, and then the Fog from around 2022 to, I still call it open-ended because there's a couple more things I would love to do with it. And then A Walk in the Dark, which is very much active right now. Spent a lot of time in the studio this weekend on it, in fact. So some of the things I'm showing you for that are very, very, very recent. So I'll try to weave in this idea of technologies of seeing throughout, but I think it will also be pretty evident. So Landmarks is a piece where I am really directly kind of engaging with these technologies of facial recognition. This is still before AI became the sort of marketing buzzword that it is. So now a lot of times you will hear facial recognition also being called AI because apparently AI can be anything you do with a computer at this point. So when I'm talking here, I gave the name Landmarks because landmarks are, again, used in facial recognition. Facial landmarks are the phrase used, a technical term used, to understand how images are categorized by machine learning systems, right? So if you think about a face typically has eyebrows, eyes, nose, mouth, jawline. Not all, right? We know that there's a huge diversity of human faces in the world, but those are sort of the kind of baseline architecture. And that idea of the landmark goes back to mapping. And so I was thinking a lot about, what does it mean to have landmarks on my face? So landmarks is an exploration of the ways machine learning, and specifically facial recognition, fails to comprehend trans bodies through misgendering, and the threat this failure possesses to trans livelihood as these technologies become increasingly integrated into our daily lives. The work consists of an interactive website featuring compositions that explore these issues. And again, when I'm thinking here of this failure to recognize, I am not inherently advocating that the best course of action is for a facial recognition software to know that I'm trans. In fact, that's probably the worst case scenario. It's that I would rather just not exist, right, to the technology at all. So this project asks us to consider how technology sees us and what happens when it fails to see us for who we really are. So when I say that this is like an interactive web interface, again, live link down there, so if you want to take the slides after the fact, you can. There are basically two versions of this project. There's one that accesses your webcam, and there are compositions that I've created that you can experience with your own face. But as a trans person who also wants to make work for trans people, I made a version of the piece that has a pre-recorded video so that you could deal with the misgendering that happens with a layer of remove, right? So you wouldn't have to actually automatically have your own gender misrecognized in order to access the piece. But the piece basically draws from this thing called faceapi.js, which is a library for JavaScript, to create these compositions that are a combination of text and visual imagery, allowing people to explore this concept of landmarks. So a landmark, of course, is a prominent or conspicuous object on land that serves as a guide, especially to ships at sea or travelers on a road. Distinguishing landscape feature marking a site or location. For example, the post office served as a landmark for locating the street to turn down. Something used to mark the boundary of land. This second definition, the boundary of land, really made me think about this idea of body as land. And I don't know about you all, but if I'm thinking about the way the United States in particular has treated the land that it has obtained, not necessarily excited about my body being understood as land, right? And so I'm starting to think about this idea that there's an intellectual gesture happening here when we apply the logic of landmark to our face. And if we are applying the logic of landmark to our face, we are opening ourselves up to the same kinds of subjugation that the land faces. This connects back to the productive bodies in the Mississippi River Project. This is a sort of a through line from that thinking. So this is a pre-recorded version. In the first page of the site, you see a pretty straightforward facial recognition composition where the landmarks, which again we can see here, are outlined. The video behind is there, but it's sort of grayed out. And then we're looking at just the emotion and the gender as a way to think about what I think are probably the two most fraught things that this library claims to have been able to understand. Next is a composition where the face moves behind what is the full text of that on exactitude in science short story, again as a way to bring in these ideas of ridiculous mapping for the viewer to see. So maps are not only renderings of a geographical area, but can also map the desires of their funders and makers. Further, these desires and goals can be transmitted along with the geographic information as maps are circulated, right? So if maps aren't neutral, then facial recognition can't be neutral, right? Because if both of these things rely on a logic of landmarking, borders, surveying, then we can understand that certain groups of people want certain things mapped. They want certain types of borders. They want certain types of understandings. In this composition, the same facial recognition software was used, but in a much more abstracting way. So in the first, it only highlights the discovery portion of the technology, so the part of the technology that identifies whether a face exists or not. So, and then from there, it maps the facial landmarks, and then from there, it starts to define. And then exploitation here is left blank because especially at the time, 2021, there was a lot of open questions about how this technology would be used to exploit human labor, freedom, etc. So if you want to take a look, this piece is live, landmarks.cloud. The no recording version is landmarks.cloud/no-live. Very, very inventive. The next piece that I want to talk about is the fog. So this started in 2022. So this work critically interrogates what society holds up as monstrous and looks to one of these figures, fog itself, as an aspirational rather than antagonistic figure. Drawing on work by Susan Stryker about the idea of trans identity and the monstrous, the work questions how subjects are perceived as monstrous and what that process says about the societies that produce them. Further, the work looks at FOG's ability to resist capture, visualization, and control as a way to develop liberatory ideas about transfuturity and embodiment. So I will also say at this time, in this moment, around 2021, 2022, I'm really starting to think a lot about who the audience of my work is. Like, who am I making work for, right? We can think about this in our writing too, but I think that there's something about the way an artist works and the way that artists' personalities are sort of objectified or baked into the work that they make, right? Like, in order for me to talk or to present my work out in the world, I also am part of that product, right? I am more than just a name on a page. I have to have, you know, an image on my website, and people have to know the story, right? And I really started to think about, like, well, am I producing artwork that's like predominantly not for trans people? Like, am I creating work that trans people are not going to like enjoy being able to see, or they're going to be made uncomfortable because I want to perhaps make cis people uncomfortable a little bit in hopes to maybe change their mind or get them to understand something? And I started to shift and started to think that I really actually wanted to make work for trans people first and foremost, and then just hope that other people will get on board. And so that kind of led to the FOG piece, really. What it led to is me thinking, instead of trying to like explain the conditions of trans people only, I also want to imagine different conditions, and conditions that might inspire other trans people to make things or think things or write things. And so the FOG for me really became an opportunity to think about the idea of visibility in our world, and how visibility politics, being not only visible as a trans person, but being a respectable trans person, a trans person that perhaps reproduced cisgender logics of what gender performance should be, that actually didn't get us anywhere except for further objectification, and now I would say, like, you know, outright violence. And so I started to imagine worlds and places and works that I could maybe invite other trans people into so that we could imagine these other futures. And one of the first pieces for that was this piece called Untitled Fog Pill, which is a short story in a sense, in a bit of an epistolary form. So it is this singular document that imagines itself as the cover sheet for the Global Open Source Archive, which I imagine to be a more data open socialist version of the Patent Office. That also imagines a group called the Trans Eco Futures Laboratory, and that they have produced this intellectual labor in 2054 that is a pill that when you swallow it, you're able to, instead of just sweating regularly, your sweat can turn into fog, so that you can emit fog from your pores, and that this could both act as a way to avoid surveillance, but it could also have positive environmental impacts in places where fog reduction is a big problem because of climate change, right? So I started to imagine, like, what would this technology be that would be restorative both to trans people and to the world that they live in? So I created this, this document and this illustration as a sort of intellectual exercise in storytelling through document. This led to more work thinking about fog. A lot of times when I'm making an artwork and I have a question or an idea or a subject, I start to look at the sort of visual language surrounding that subject. One such thing for fog is fog lights. So if you've ever been on a boat up close or seen the fog lights on a plane, some of this is in your car as well. There's the sort of ridged glass, right, on a light, on a headlamp, that allows that to amplify, called a Fresnel lens. And I was really interested in the way that that amplified light out to sort of pierce through fog, and I wanted to invert that process. And so I created these sculptures that have textured glass and light inside, but the light doesn't project out, you have to look in. So you have to like really look down at these screens. This is like a USB-C plug, so that gives you a sense of the scale, right? These are like this big, quite small. And when you get up close, you can see that there is an ongoing procedurally generated piece, text and image piece going in each one of these. This is the first version of the work that operated in acts. And so this became also the foundation for my commission for the San Jose Museum of Art, which is another interactive web piece, where Act 1 is about the fog of war, thinking about this idea of the fog representing a lack of information, that lack of information representing a problem for military and economic investment. 2, the horror of fog, which thinks through the ways in which fog figures into horror novels and other horror media. And then 3, in the fog, or of the fog. So thinking about, okay, how is fog a problem to colonization? How are people afraid of fog? And then how can I be fog as a way to be terrifying and a problem, basically, but in an empowering sort of way. So that first, that piece just a minute ago had the 3 different screens. I then took that and I built this 3D interactive web space that does the same. You'll notice that it looks a little crunchy, a little pixelated, and that's because this seemingly 3D image is actually being live rendered as text characters. So this is, if you've ever heard of ASCII art, like from the 80s and 90s, this is live updating ASCII art. So you could actually take and highlight this and copy and paste it into like a document to get a screenshot of the thing. The other portion of this is that I really wanted this sort of like data materiality of the thing that I was doing to be at the front, right? Because if I'm talking about obfuscation, if I'm talking about not being able to see, if I'm talking about ways to sort of live in or bask in a lack of knowing, I wanted to sort of confront the viewer in some way with the idea that they were always aware that this was a synthetic image, sort of a anti-immersion in a way, where I'm like, I don't want you to think that you're actually in this space. I want you to know that this is a synthetic space at all times. Another note about this piece was a personal goal of mine was to create this piece more sustainably. So a lot of times when we think about 3D graphics, we think of like really heavy pieces of technology that take a lot of resources. But this piece, all 3 acts and the entire website is only 2.5 megabytes. So if you were illegally downloading a song on LimeWire in the year 2003, it would be about the same size as one of those songs that you were downloading. And that's really important to me because I am someone who, of course, has all of these ideas about visibility and transness, and I'm trying to think about these things in the work that I do, but we are also living on a planet that's in crisis, and I think it's incumbent upon everyone, especially those of us who work with material, right? Like those of us who are doing things with objects in the world, to think about those things in like a really nuanced way. So part of this piece and the piece I'll show you later today are really about kind of practicing a sort of sustainability that leans into the sort of limitations that I'm imposing on myself rather than seeing them as like simply a detriment, right? So this is not 4K, 60 frames per second, whatever you might think of for like a video game version, right? If I were to make this in like a video game engine, it might be 2, 3, 4 gigabytes and need a whole thing. And instead it's 2.5 megabytes and you can run it on a laptop from 2015 and it costs people nothing to run. All things that I find really important about the work. The next piece that I want to talk about with the fog is called Self-Portrait as Fog. This is a recast bronze piece completed in 2024. So in 2015, I was in a graduate program for sculpture. And again, this was right around the transgender tipping point. This is right when a lot of people are like, hey, you're a trans person, you're making art, your body should be in there. Why isn't there more of you, physically you, in the work that you're making? And I was trying at this time, as many grad students are, a lot of different things to figure out like what's my path, like what is it that I want to do? And so I made this nude self-figure sculpture, or self-portrait sculpture in bronze. And I wasn't unhappy with the result, but I was unhappy with people viewing the result. And so for 9 years, it stayed wrapped in bubble wrap as I moved from California to Wisconsin, back to California, and then here to Virginia. And I decided at some point, I'm in San Jose, California, so they got finished in 2024. But these pieces are really a gesture of me, again, like refusing to be seen or refusing to have my image be attached to this sort of directly figurative, voyeuristic sort of process that I was becoming deeply uncomfortable and disillusioned with. Resist the fantasy of all-seeing and all-knowing, bask in and embody the fog. And the instructions on the back Place between yourself and that which seems clear. Adjust until unclear and reconsider. Right? So it's just a sort of semi-ridiculous poetic gesture. And the reason I created this was because I wanted a tool for myself to be able to be like, if I'm reading an email or looking at a news story or into the world around you. Here's a prototype of that in my studio. And again, the print template available online for those that want it. Then I have Fog as In. Fog as In is a poem made for the ViewMaster. So I don't know if any of you, how many of you have used the ViewMaster in your life, right? Many of us. I had a set of ViewMaster discs that were just inherited from like all sorts of people in my family. None of them were actually interesting, but I loved the device as a child. And so I started collecting them a little bit. I've got a couple of them. This one is from the 1950s. And I started looking at the design. And when you look at the thing and you look at the disc, it's sort of like deceptively simple. But when I started to look at how it was made, it's like, okay, this is a stereoscopic image. There are 7 slides. And the way that those slides are sort of arrayed around the disc are actually very specific. And I got really interested in not only the strange semi-3D fake space inside the glasses, but also like how might an idea composed for that space look and feel specific to that space. So I created this ViewMaster disc. Works, although I will say after about 1,000 uses, which I got at a gallery recently, I'm going to have to refurbish and make new ones. But they do actually work in a current ViewMaster. So I composed a poem that imagines both the 7-line poem as a specific form and also the sort of fake 3D space of the ViewMaster as a space to tell a story. So this is what that looks like in stereoscopic. So like this would be your left eye and that would be your right eye. And I'm going to talk through it here in just a sec. To be trans for me is to whirl and waft in between. And in that motion, expose and complicate the strictures of my life. It is to be like fog, to settle and roil between fixed objects. To exist in negative space is to accentuate and complicate that which you are between. As the fog complicates the street corner, I complicate the normative structures my fluid body comes into contact with. I may not change it directly, but it surely changes when it is seen in relation to me. So the last piece that I want to talk about is current work. This is a walk in the dark. I think you'll probably very clearly be able to see the through line from the fog work to this work. This work was started in a residency, funded in fact by ICAT in 2024. I had the opportunity to go to Ireland right around the time of our election, a strange time to be out of the country, to work and start to initiate this piece. And so I did want to talk about that just a little bit to say that, I show a lot of the work in a lot of different places, but a lot of these ideas take many years to germinate. And I might go, 3 months of doing a lot of studio work and then go away from the studio work for a couple months, maybe write, think, sketch, do something else, and come back to it. And so at first, when I was first out of grad school, I was really stressed by this process. Like, am I not doing enough? Am I not producing enough? But once, a couple projects got under my belt, I started to realize that this is just a rhythm, the rhythm that I work in. And so what you're going to be seeing now is the first sort of completely solidified version of the piece that I just moved to what I'm calling version 1.0 as of about a week and a half ago. But that work, really started in November 2024. So it's been a pretty long process to get to where this is now. So this work is a work in progress that employs both a browser-based experience and a physical sculptural artist book to explore the liberatory power of being enshrouded by darkness or fog. I'm interested in creating interactive experiences that allow viewers to reclaim or reimagine darkness and fog as an empowering spaces for trans thriving. Extended from recent work on fog and recent explorations on darkness, this work will use text, imagery, and interaction design to foster a kinship with obfuscation and imagine a turn from the fear of the unknown to the power of the unknown. Tangential to this is also increased look at horror as a genre. So horror as a genre is something that I have been attracted to for a long time, and I'm starting to think about like how those things can exist in a fine arts practice more specifically. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the sculptural book portion of that and how those things relate to one another. Just a little bit of a time check for like 7 minutes. Is that about right? Left or so? Okay. So a tunnel book, or a peep show book, I don't like that term, it kind of freaks me out a little bit, is a book from the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s where they would have these layers, right? So this is from 1740. And this is a restored version. You can see on the left-hand side where they're using plexiglass to sort of put those panels in the order that they would have been in, right? But it's a way to create this sort of tunnel, three-dimensional space that you would look through, right? So it is a book, but it is sculptural. It is, of course, very much related to the stage. And I'm really interested in the interplay between artist publication of books and the internet and the web and also games as like a tangential or related space of publication, right? So if there can be an artist book, then there is an artist game or an artist website, right? And so I'm thinking a lot about how I can move these ideas between and around one another. So A Walk in the Dark is created using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Similar to the other piece that I was showing you, it is like a very low resource intensive project, but is like, I would say very visually dense still. So all of the 3D space and animation that you're going to see in the video when you see the video is produced using code rather than like 3D modeling. So I'm not going into like a 3D modeling software and making boxes and squares and circles and making animation and putting that in Premiere and all of these things. Instead, it's all being written in code. And that's because I'm really interested in procedural generation as a way to access nonlinearity. So what does that mean? Procedural generation is an idea in computer programming of being able to sort of have a structured randomness, right? So if any of you have played a game like Spelunky, for example, or any other roguelike game, or if you have ever played D&D or used a random number generating device for any purpose, you're engaging with a type of procedural generation, right? What procedural generation means for me is that instead of saying, here is the A to B story arc of the thing that I'm trying to make, I instead say, here is the space that I want to invite a viewer to be in. Here are the elements, the components of that space. I'm now going to curate those into a semi-random assortment that I know will result in a certain type of experience, but an experience that is also infinitely variable. Right? So that is really the balance. And for me, again, this gets to a capacity for code to allow us to live in or work in or think in a nonlinear space. Right? There are all sorts of problematic things that happen with code every day, but it's not going anywhere. And I also find it to be actually, for me, very intellectually aligned in terms of I can think in code like as I'm driving home, and then I can go home and I can write it. The same way that I can like think about something and then go home and draw it or go home and sculpt it. I have found code to be another medium that I can do that in, and that it is particularly good at doing this nonlinearity thing. Before I get to the video, I'll mention like this is an in-progress view of my home studio where I'm starting to also do the physical book forms. And I'm trying to imagine what is that code-based procedural generation? How can I make that in a physical tactile book? Right? So you think back to the spine book, the point rather than a line spine book. This is another iteration of that kind of thinking, right? Of like, what is an artist book if it is not a linear story? And like, what are the limits of something being called a book? Is it still a book? Is it a sculpture? If I base it off a historical structure, like the tunnel book, will you all believe me when I tell you that it's a book, right? So I'm really starting to think about what are the lines of these things. Okay, so good timing here. The last thing I want to do is I just want to show you the video version of the Walk in the Dark piece. So what you're going to see is one cycle through this virtual tunnel book. This piece has a total of 6 poems. Each poem has 6 lines. So a full cycle is you going through the cycle 6 times, right? 6 loops to make one full thing. You're going to be seeing one. Basically what happens is on each scene, a line of the poem is rendered and a scene is rendered. And then when you get to the end of the loop, the order of the scene changes, but the new poem is selected and that poem is played in the same order. Again, all of that is happening with all of this code. So you're also going to hear sound. That sound that I composed using a semi-modular synthesis keyboard. So all of the visual, sound, and text are all composed by me. And that's it. Thank you.
So we can open it up to questions if people have some.
Thank you, Chelsea. This was just wonderful. And I wanted to ask, because you mentioned how you learned to use power tools when you were very little. And I'm always curious about how people learn codes, because where I come from in Brazil, the access it's different. So I was wondering, how did you get into code? How did you learn it? How the start? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks. It's funny because I now teach our Introduction to Creative Coding course, so keep that in mind when I tell you how I learned code, which is not that. So when I was in graduate school the first time, I was in California and I was in a sculpture program, and I had this idea. It was an idea based off of this piece, actually, the piece that translates English into this sort of coded alphabet. And I realized that I could just create a font on your computer that would be that alphabet, and I didn't actually have to do a lot of code. But then for a show, I was like, hey, I really want it to be that, like, when people talk in the space, it does speech to text, and their text shows up on the wall in this coded language, which is really quite simple because it's just speech to text on a wall with font, right? You would think quite simple. That whole idea is what spurred me learning code. Before that, I had not known code. I will say that my friends and I took apart computers and did things like that in high school just for fun, but we weren't like coding. We were just like, oh, hey, so-and-so's mom gave us this computer and it doesn't work. Maybe if we can get it fixed up, we can use it to play video games. Like, so we were using computers in that way. And I think that in particular, there's a sort of generation of people, sometimes called millennials, who had access to computers, but those computers were not very good at telling you what to do. And so there's a certain kind of facility that I think comes with our generation. But yeah, it was very project-based. And so from that first project, you know, I learned something called processing, which was Java, in order to make that project happen. And from there, I just slowly started finding myself thinking about projects through that lens. And so I started to just make more projects with code. And so for the piece that I showed there at the very end, that's using a library called 3JS. I first used that for the fog piece, and I just went and read the documentation and learned it, which is not how most people end up learning code. I just have found that for me, a lot of the way that people who make open source software think is very aligned with the way I think. And I find it very, I find myself really easily to kind of like access their kind of like ways of thinking, which I think is I feel very fortunate for. In my classes, I try to expose students through projects, right? Because I think that for most people who are not in CS, who are not in STEM, you know, if you're in the humanities and the arts, a lot of this stuff is not interesting until you can think of something to actually do with it. And so I really try to emphasize that, like, let's learn what a function is or what a variable is. That's terribly boring. But instead, like, what would it mean for you to make your own interactive avatar that reflected who you are? Well, that's maybe a more interesting question for a broader group of people. So. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you for your talk today. So I was thinking a lot about how you were describing fog and as like a very big physical presence, and how a lot of your work started during COVID. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on what it means, not only to, like you say, embody the fog, but like I started thinking about brain fog and like mental fog, and like the question of not even like knowing oneself and how that might align with your work.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, so the first part of the fog actually comes from my experience as a kid growing up on the Mississippi River, which got really, really heavy fog flows. And what would happen is the fog would be so dense that they would have to delay school. And I went to a Catholic grade school, and I was so thankful every day that school got delayed. So that was like my first, exposure to fog. But then, of course, during COVID, I was living in the Bay Area, which is also very well known for its fog. And so there's all of this kind of visual stuff. But I did, in fact, find one of the really strange things about COVID, especially teaching during COVID. I was teaching at San Jose State University at that time, and we stayed online for 2 full years. So most of my students never had a physical interaction with me. It was all digitally mediated. And of course, there's things like face tune-up on Zoom, right? Where it's like, I don't have to put on makeup if I want makeup. I can just like put that slider up until I look insane on the Zoom thing, right? And it does start to kind of make you think about like, yeah, what is the value of realness, quote unquote, in a world that doesn't seem to actually want my realness in a way? And so for me, it came a lot down to the visual perception. But and I feel very fortunate that I have never had a strong case of COVID or had COVID brain fog in that sense. But I do think like there was like a strange both liberation in COVID isolation for me as a trans person, and then there's also that kind of stir craziness, right? And it's sort of a mixture where I'm like, I desperately want to see people, but I also desperately love not having to perform for cis society. And that for me is, I hope that there's a version of this fog and darkness thing where it's sort of like the option to obfuscate rather than the need to be subsumed in it, right? So like obfuscation as like a gesture or a tactic rather than like in a thing that you must are compelled to do. I don't know if that totally answers your question, but. Mm-hmm.
So Rebecca online has a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Chelsea, thank you so much for this brilliant presentation. It was so intellectually generative. I have a question for you about the politics of recognition. So you discussed the politics where there are violences against trans people. has really grown. And in order to kind of combat that, there has been a kind of politics of rights, that trans people have rights, that those rights should be respected. And oftentimes those rights are contingent on some form of recognition. So I was just kind of thinking about how we might recognize rights with FOG. And I didn't know kind of what you were thinking about in terms of the political claims you were making.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm breaking up.
Yeah,
Thanks.
no, that makes sense. I'm not going to remember the book off the top of my head. This is going to drive me nuts. There is a smart person who I'm kind of quoting here a little bit, and I'm not trying to plagiarize, I promise. My brain is just not functioning. For me, that idea of recognition, I find like, for a long time, I believed in it. I was like, well, if people just understand more, then like they'll see that we're human and that that's totally fine. And I've started to really not believe that. And I really think that a much more radical understanding of like acceptance of like an open society is one where I don't actually need to know anything about you. I don't need to know anything about you to know that you deserve to have bodily autonomy. That I don't need to know anything about you to know that you deserve health care and food and water and shelter. And for me, I hope that that's the kind of politics that can be produced with this FOG thing, is that like I can approach you in the FOG and I don't have to know you to know that you're another person and that you deserve the same things that I deserve, which is like peace and safety. And that recognition is maybe actually a privilege, something that I only give to people that I trust. And so that recognition becomes something that I withhold for those that have earned it, rather than something that I use to try to earn other people's respect. Like I guess another way to put this is to say that like, as a trans person, when I am recognized as trans, I often find that leads to not great things sometimes. And there are periods of time in my life where passing was really important, or there are periods of time when absolutely not passing is important. For example, I'm married, my wife and I sometimes have problems on the phone, and every now and again, because my voice is the way it is, I'm able to drop an octave or two and sound like a man on the phone and pass as a man and get things done on a phone call with a very pushy salesperson, right? And so like in that way, like I don't need recognition of my transness always to have power. That's a little bit of a tangent, but I really do think that like this gets back to sort of like identity politics for me in general, right? And it's like, I think in some ways identity politics are important when we talk about describing struggles and when we talk about describing systemic inequity, but I don't necessarily believe that identity politics is useful when we're talking about how we achieve a more just or more equitable society. So in some ways, I think identity politics does a great job of explaining the world as is, but it doesn't necessarily help us imagine the world we might want to have.
Hello, thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, and I really appreciated the opportunity to see more of your work and the way that your work is both like online and not online. I was really struck by your use of definitions like throughout the different pieces you presented. And I guess like I'm curious how, if definition was like a specific choice, because so much of your work is about blurring boundaries, but also definitions make things so clear. So I was just wanted to hear more about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And in fact, I am really fascinated by definitions because similar to like the slide about maps, right? And maps sort of carrying with them the politics of the people that fund them. I think definitions in a lot of ways do that same thing, right? Like when I'm talking about the definition of a landmark, that's useful to me not only because it puts us all on the same page, but it does, like when I pulled up a definition in an arts context, in this context, suddenly you're like, wait, what? Like it kind of like calls into question the power around that term simply by raising it in this space, right? So like disciplinarily in the arts, yeah, we're not doing a lot of definition of terms. And so when we do a definition of terms, it's usually to set up some kind of critique. And I think that there's a mode of contemporary art making in discourse where yeah, the use of definitions is really a way to sort of call to question the definition itself, and it's something that you know, frankly, I find appealing in other artists making work, and I find myself doing that too. So yeah, I think it does a similar thing to the map thing of just like, hey, why is this? Why is it this way? Why are things structured in this sense? And hopefully gets us to start, you know, pulling that thread a little bit.
Hi, thank you so much for that. I have about 6 hours worth of questions, but what I'd like to ask now is about the last piece and the use, at least in the pieces you showed us, of sound.
Mm-hmm.
What role that's playing in your current thinking, and how you came to sort of integrate or think about sound as another space for exploring this theme, because one of the other things I think, and many of us when we think about fog, is fog horns.
Mm-hmm.
And the sort of piercing possibilities, but also the sort of somewhat unlocatable piercing possibilities of sound there.
Yeah, thank you. So the fog pieces, some of those do have sound when you go on the website. One of them has a bit of a fog horn, but I have found that when you try to play that through like Zoom sound or computer sound, like piping it through multiple systems, it like doesn't come across. And then the horror piece actually uses whatever your current browser is. It uses its accessibility features to read out loud text that's like flowing out of the earth. And so it will use whatever strange voice your computer uses, and then it also programmatically slows it down to make it sound even more horrifying. So that was some of the first uses of sound in those interactive pieces. And I do love that sound, but again, it's like it doesn't translate as well to a recorded space like this. But in this last piece, I was really starting to think about soundscapes. And so I said that it was created using modular synthesis, which is basically it's this thing that looks like a keyboard, and then it's got a bunch of like portholes up at top and all these dials. And it uses like signal modification, analog synthesis to create these sort of loops. And so the way that I use it is kind of similar to the procedural generation, where I'm sort of starting with something very basic, and then I'm building up these layers. And so what you were hearing in that video was basically enough types of signal manipulation that I could hit the keyboard once every 20 seconds, and it would create all of those strange reverberations and warbles. And I was trying to create you know, a sort of psychic space that felt to me the way I felt when I was looking at the visual piece. So then, and this gets to that transdisciplinary thing, it's like then I create the piece, and then I'm listening to that sound as I'm modifying and revising the visual space and back and forth. And so that starts to become this interplay. But yeah, this is the first piece that I've really done like a soundscape for. And it's really, yeah, it was about sort of setting an emotional tone and thinking a little bit about how, you know, if you're looking at this at your browser at home, that's one very specific space. And there's sort of limited, I think, emotional registers available to me as an artist making something for this size screen. And sound seemed like another lever I could pull to like get people where I was hoping they would be. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for the talk. So I was really appreciative of how you talked about audience and the way that audience was not built into the work necessarily. And I think within academia, sometimes we imagine that the audience is already built in and already being interpolated and already being like brought into the conversation or exist in the conversation. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the experience of your art, because you mentioned the slides that got turned 1,000 times, and just, of course, not disclosing any information about who was at your art exhibits, but just something that maybe came up that was remarkable about the experience, or you in the space with the audience members and the art, and just kind of giving a tactile sense of things.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, this is also one of the strange things about being an artist who shows work all over but lives in Blacksburg, Virginia, is that I often don't get to be in the same space as all of this work. So, but I do take opportunities. So like I should have brought the ViewMaster with me today. But I've shown it to students and I've shown it in smaller contexts. And it is really lovely to sort of see the way that people will hold it. And then because it doesn't have a light, but it has these kind of clear things in the back, right? People will look to the light or they'll look down and they're trying to like approximate the kind of light they need to see the thing. And I'm always, one of the reasons I'm drawn to the internet as a space is because I think that tactile experience can be really stifling actually in a white cube gallery. I'm sure you've all been to a museum and you're like, how am I supposed to stand? Like if my elbow goes out, is it gonna like punch through an oil painting from 300 years ago? And it's not actually like it's not an inviting space a lot of the time. And so I like to make work that in some way invites that kind of like tactile or physical sense when I can, because I think that for me, it sort of short circuits some of the other walls that go up. So for example, with the piece that I handed out, I've had a couple people who have made their own versions, cut this out and actually made their own frame and then sent me pictures of the frame that they made. And to just kind of like see their hand on top of my hand really in a way is like really, really exciting. And then, yeah, I think, for some of the digital work, the fog piece has also been shown as a projected work in like a dim room with just a keyboard and a mouse. Not a full keyboard, just the arrow keys and a mouse. And viewers were welcome to come up and watch and play and interact with it. And then it was really interesting in the photos that I saw of the number of people who really enjoyed being a spectator of it. And for myself, I'm like, I want to play it. I want to do the thing with it. But I think a lot of people are actually really attracted to like spectating someone else's interaction with the work. And so I'm really also excited. I was excited by that, and I want to think about ways for this new piece to offer kind of like similar interactions where folks would have the opportunity to like perceive or view someone else's reading of the piece. It's a little bit hard to see or hard to understand in that video, but that piece basically, you can walk forwards or you can walk backwards. And when you hit a key, it moves you forward a certain amount to that kind of blurry text space, and then you move forward again. And so in a gallery, it would be 2 buttons, and a person could decide how to advance the piece. And I think that for me, I'm really interested in both the viewer that wants the tactile experience and the viewer that wants to watch someone have a tactile experience, if that makes sense.
Hi, thank you. I really enjoyed this. My question is about fog as like a technical component in software, specifically games, how it's often used as a way to mask technical limitations. That's something that you talk about where you really want your work to not be resource intensive, and commonly fog is used as a means to achieve that. And I'm curious if that was something that you kind of came across in your work or that you thought about. Yes,
absolutely. Thank you for that. In fact, the first slide that said the fog texture behind it was from the game Civilization V. There's a screen capture from that game that was then blown up. Yeah, I mean, I will be honest, games as well as fiction are a huge part of like my media appetites, like a thing that I experience a lot. And yeah, Silent Hill as a game that, was, as a horror person, I actually don't play horror video games because they scare me too much. I love reading a horror book. It's like my favorite genre. And for a while, I thought I just didn't like horror. And it's like, oh no, I'm just a baby and I can't play the horror games because like I have to control the thing that's the horror is happening to, and I can't do it. And so, that actually kind of informs some of these pieces, because yes, I want the fog and I want some of that uncomfortableness, but I don't want it to be so much that a person's gonna like, there's no jump scares in my work. But yeah, I think for me, I'm really, really inspired by technological limitations in the ways that people have adapted to those. I mean, the same thing with the viewfinder, right? It's like, that's a piece of technology that's very old, and yet I still think that there's artistic potential that hasn't been tapped there. There are artists right now who are developing games for the Nintendo Entertainment System and for the Sega Genesis and all of these old consoles. And it's like a lot of this technology is dead because of a lack of corporate investment, not because of creative potential. And yeah, so things like the fog covering up the draw distance is like, that's beautiful to me, because it's like, oh, that is like, that it does create what people remember as like one of the more important visual aspects of the game, and yet it came, you know, predominantly from a technical limitation. And I love that back and forth, that interplay between like what's technically possible and what's aesthetically relevant, and like trying to sort of thread that needle in a way. I find that to be one of the really exciting things about trying to work sustainably. It's like, oh yeah, I've put these limits on myself, and now the limits actually can become really interesting and fun things to push against rather than just like bummers.
So there's some things in the chat that I think are relevant to what you're just saying, and I wanted to share it. But Jovine said, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, I think that it made me think about how fog serves as a mechanism for unlearning that is especially as important as learning, especially in what we view as expertise and knowledge. And then Sam followed up with that. Has me thinking about the right to be forgotten and the technologies of fugitivity. Just I loved it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is one of the, yeah, that's a really troubling thing to me in terms of like the way technology is being deployed in this moment. It's like it's, you know, I don't know if anyone went to the academic freedom forum yesterday, but one of the things that the guest Tom Ginsberg talked about was that, like, you know, someone releasing an op-ed in a paper in 1909 is like a very different power dynamics than someone writing something on Twitter today, and that like your work can be taken out of context much more quickly, or your words can be taken out of context much more quickly, and that you know, exposes different types of people to different types of risk, right? That not everyone experiences that as a positive thing, right? It's not like, oh, look at the reach I have. It's like, oh no, look at the reach I have. This is not a good thing. And so yeah, I think, you know, for me, I've always kind of desired to not have to not have to be known. It's one of the things I really love about big cities, honestly, is like not being recognized. I'm from a very small town, and I think growing up, I had the experience a lot of like going to places with my parents and then knowing 16 people in the grocery store and us stopping every 2 seconds. And there's something lovely about people you know, right? But there's also something lovely about being able to move through the world and not be seen and not feel like there's a spotlight on you. And I think digitally we have this kind of these same problematics, and they're getting worse. It's like a lot harder to escape the things that you have said online, and I think that there's real damage done when we can't say things and know that the things we say will likely be forgotten. Like when there's a forever archive. We can often think in academia we're like, ooh, an archive, that's so nice, but an archive is not always nice, right? It's like not always a great thing, and I think we're living through some of that right now. Yeah.
I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you so much. There's a lot of, I think, you know, a lot of us have commented on how generative is and how many things that we have to think about. And so this idea of the fog, I really, you know, I like this idea of, you know, the non-recognition or the ability to pass not recognized. And I think that that's a really, you know, at the same time, you know, what are we finding out that's monstrous now is knowing too much, and our neighbors are monstrous, and we're monstrous to our own families. And the more we know about each other, the more we find out things about each other that we don't like, and they become tools, they become taken up by political tools. So, and the face is this thing of a terrain that is the most individuating thing about you, also could be used in a very generic way as landmarks to, so this idea about monstrous, I was just thinking about this more, but I was also thinking the conclusion you draw from that is that, you know, look, I want to make art for trans people, and I want to make art for trans people first. But at the same time, a lot of the kinds of conclusions and a lot of the politics around this is very universalizing. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that just seemed to me to be something where it's like, you know, you start at trans as like a standpoint and a position from which to evaluate a lot of these questions, but then it goes to the universal. It goes to a universal space too. So, you know, may start at trans, but it goes somewhere else.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's actually, I love that you brought that up, because I totally believe that to be the case, and that a lot of this stuff like does have universal implications. And for me, it comes down to like, when it comes to like making work for trans people, I am more thinking of like the affective experience of the work itself, and that has required me to have faith, right? That very thing. It's like if I'm making work for trans people and that they're going to have like an affective experience that is like generative and positive, I have faith that it is in fact a universal thing, and thus, despite making it mostly for trans people, it is not only going to be for trans people because it's letting people in. And I actually think that some of the work before that was maybe not, it didn't actually get to some of those universal things because I wasn't allowing myself to just like be like, yeah, trans life becomes a problem for a lot of violent systems. And I think that once you talk about those problems, people can start to recognize the violent systems, and they won't necessarily recognize it as trans people being a problem. They'll see the system as like as the problem. And I often think about my work as like an onion. And this gets back to questions about the audience. And it's like, what is there for someone who spends 10 seconds looking at the work? What's there for someone that spends a minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, wants to do like a close reading book interpretation of the work, right? And like thinking through all of those layers of viewer and trying to think like, what is there on offer for people, and what might people take away in 30 seconds versus 10 minutes versus an hour versus something else, and do all of those speak to that specific to universal arc. Yeah, I think it's a complicated, but for me it's like a really generative question. Yeah.
Thank you. I really liked when, at the end, when you were talking about like nonlinear storytelling, and how it was about creating like an environment that like an audience can interact with. It reminded me of a quote. I don't know who said it. I think it was like from a music reviewer who said that like some songs are like rooms that you can sit in and hang out in for a long time. And then afterwards you were talking about like how you see coding as just like another art medium. And I thought that was interesting because in my experience, I always thought that coding was, this really strict thing that has like certain logic that you have to follow. And like, so I was wondering if you had anything more to say about like how you view, being able to use coding as just like a means to create your art and not like a strict thing with like these rules and guidelines that you have to follow?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, yeah, I think part of this shift, there's kind of two parts to it. One is like, if I'm making a wood sculpture, we might think, oh, that's so much more freeing. It's like so much more expressive. But it's like if I'm using a table saw, there's some pretty strict, actually, rules in place to not like cut yourself or get kickback. And in some ways, I find the digital space to be really forgiving, because it's like, when I'm drawing like on a piece of paper, like it's like having a perfect eraser, and like there is no perfect eraser. Like every time you erase, you're eroding the paper, or you're not getting up all of your material. And so the digital, one of the things that I love about it as someone who learned from like a very tactile space, but now is existing in a more digital space. So I'm like, oh, it's like, it's an oil painting that never dries. I can go back into it for as long as I want, which is both an amazing thing, and it can also be a bit of a curse, kind of like, as you've all probably felt with like a Word document, you're like, is this correct? Should I actually submit? Or surely there's a typo somewhere or something, right? So there's that aspect of it where I just actually find the idea that I can just like open it back up and come back to it. And the other thing that for me is like, I really think about it as like little pieces. So, and, there is very strict logic, but if you kind of break it down to like, this little piece of code makes a box. Okay, how do I make 1,000 boxes? right? Or like this little piece of code makes the camera move forward. And so when I'm building the things, I'm just thinking about it as like little bits and then putting little bits together, which is not dissimilar to how I would think about sculpture or any other medium. And the other thing for me, the last thing about that is that I really find that if you can kind of get past the feedback loop of code being like a negative thing, right? Because I think for a lot of us, we think of code, we think of math class, and we think about a right or wrong answer, and we think about like dreading it maybe, perhaps. But if instead we can kind of like think about it, it's like the code doesn't care that I got it wrong. It's not going to work, but it doesn't care. And so I can just kind of keep going at it till I get it right, right? It's like, it's the most forgiving collaborator, actually, because it's like, I can mess up 1,000 times, and it's going to be like, hey, Chelsea, I still am not going to work. Hey, I'm not going to work. Hey, I'm not going to work. And then finally it works. And so I think a lot of that comes down to mindset. But yeah, for me, the nonlinearity, I love that idea of like a song being a room, and I do think of that. I think about my work as spaces a lot, and I think for me it's just that like the code allows for an infinitely variable space, and I think there's maybe a benefit that I come at it from this project-based, visual-based angle rather than from like a CS background, learning it from how would you say, like a foundations level, like what is a variable, what is a function, what is a class, what is object-oriented programming. It's like I learned these things many years after starting, and I think that for me that helped it become more of a playful media rather than something that is like dogmatic. But it does, I do think that there's a lot of things about the visual language of code that do feel dogmatic and unfriendly. The other thing you may have noticed is that my code editor is like purple with like different colors. And I find something as simple as just like making your space your own can also be really helpful in like making it feel like, oh, like it's not this cold thing over there. It's like purple and hot pink and all of these things. And like that also helps me like hang in this space more. Yeah.
So we are at time, but I want to thank everybody for coming today, and let's give Chelsea another round of applause.
Thank you.
We will have another speaker next week, so see you guys then.
Hey, Chelsea.
Mm-hmm.
What's